Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Bryce Wakefield. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, and welcome to the Institute's national office here in Canberra, and of course, a warm welcome to those joining us online as well. At the AIIA, we pride ourselves on providing a platform for rigorous, independent, and timely analysis of global affairs. And when it comes to timely topics and speakers to address them, well, I probably don't need to introduce either the situation that we're in globally today or indeed our speaker tonight. That said, I will, because you deserve it. We are incredibly keen to hear your reflections this evening, because while much of the world has watched developments in the United States from a distance over the past 6 months, and further back, John Blaxland has had a sort of ringside seat for the last 2 years. Now, given John's deep background and intelligence, I was tempted tonight to introduce him as our man in Washington, but I suspect there might be some at DFAT or indeed ASIO who might be listening in, and they wouldn't exactly be thrilled with that appellation for a private citizen. So let's go with a safer and fully accurate version. John Blaxland is the ANU's man in Washington. He is the director of the Australian National University's North America Liaison Office in Washington, D.C., and he is Professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Coral Bell School at ANU. A former military and intelligence officer and one of Australia's most respected historians of defence and foreign policy, he has authored or co-authored more than a dozen books and regularly lends insights to the media and public discourse. In recognition of his contributions, he was made a Fellow of the Australian Institute of International Affairs in 2024, and we were very proud to have him in that club, which is our most prestigious award at the Institute. Tonight, he'll be sharing insights from his time in Washington under the second Trump administration, a period that, to say the least, has sparked more than its share of strategic questions and scholarly debates, not to mention Twitter threads, and I guess Truth Social threads as well. As John draws on his experience, academic depth, and signature clarity, I'm sure we're in for a talk that will provoke plenty of thought and perhaps even a little anxiety about where US foreign policy might go next and what it means for allies like Australia. To our online participants, you're welcome to start submitting your questions at any time using the Q&A function. We'll aim to take as many as we can after John's remarks. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to all First Nations people joining us today. Please join me in welcoming Professor John Blaxland.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, a real pleasure for me to join you this evening. And I just want to add to that acknowledgement to pay my respects to the Piscataway, Pamunkey and Anacostia people in DC, in the DMV area. Some people who from that area might be listening in, I suspect. So look, I'm delighted to be here talking tonight about what I'm calling from the bubble to the swamp and back. Some reflections on an opinionated professor's view on what the blazes is going on and what on earth it might mean. Essentially, I like to tell my American friends that the world looks different from down under, right? And I start with this one, which is the RAF planning map, centred on Darwin, but spun 45 degrees, to give you a sense of Australia hanging off Asia and of the Indo-Pacific, the space we live in, and of what Joko Widodo, the former president of Indonesia, talked about as the maritime fulcrum, which we share with Indonesia, right? So I did this study, a SWOT analysis, which led me to write a paper called Adapting to Polycrisis. And my point is that in the paper, I argue we're dealing with great power competition, looming environmental catastrophe, a spectrum of governance challenges accelerated by the fourth industrial revolution. And I thought I was pretty clever with all of that. Then, of course, Donald Trump got elected and made me having to rethink what I was saying. I'll just see if I can, just go back. The button there. Can we get rid of that one? Ethan? The OK button. Network. There we go. So what we're seeing is an apparent transactional retreat from ideational leadership. So we've seen the United States president talk about annexing Canada, Greenland and Panama, walking back from the USAID, US Agency for International Development, and cutting the voice of America. And of course, my colleagues in academia, we like to just decry or denounce or tear apart the so-called rules-based international order. And I say it's a bit like the Holy Roman Empire. Not holy, not Roman, not an empire, right? All right. But it still exists. And while we like to decry it, we actually don't want it to completely go away, which is what's really rattling about what's happening at the moment, because the United States under President Trump doesn't seem to give it that much credence, and placing more emphasis on relationships with autocrats than with close partners. Now, there seems to be some strategy to this, and I think there is some method to the madness. And I would also just caution, one of the things that strikes me is that the Trump phenomenon, if you like, is a reflection of a dissatisfaction with the status quo in the United States. A quarter of a century of adventurism, going back arguably, you could say it goes back to the Gulf of Tonkin and the deception of Congress, and then the kind of the slow acclimatization of the idea of actually telling porcupines and telling the people of America that things were okay, that weapons of mass destruction were there, and so on. And before you know it, you're spending trillions of dollars on wasted causes while China is rising without you even noticing. And this has generated enormous backlash, which I think goes some way to explain the Trump phenomenon. The big beautiful tariffs are, I think, shocking us all, and I think this is a little bit damaging. It's adversarial and it's a bit transactional, a bit too transactional, in my view. And I suspect there may well be a blowback. And of course, the other thing I bear in mind is, when I was a kid, we were taught about the Smoot-Hawley Act in 1930, right? Which was after the New York Stock Exchange crash in 1929. The US administration introduced the Smoot-Hawley Act, which is about imposing tariffs on the world. And of course, what could go wrong? Well, of course, lots went wrong. We had a decade of the Great Depression that followed. For some reason, the government in the United States today doesn't think that applies. And they may be right. They may be right. But evidence would suggest, the historical precedent would suggest they're probably not. And now they may have some insights that we common people don't quite have. We may be missing something, but I suspect there's a real challenge ahead as arising from this. So where are we going? That's not going. Just click. Yeah, just click on the screen. There we are. So what I'm saying is, when we think about we're seeing Trump's aims to unbind the executive from constraints imposed by the legislative and judiciary. My professor, my supervisor, my PhD supervisor made this point. The left railed against globalism, hoping for a socialist global nirvana, and instead they've got Jacksonian nationalism. Disinclined to care about international institutions. And it's not isolationism. It's really important. It's not isolationist, but it is mercantilist and it is unilateralist. And that is, I think, something we're all struggling to come to grips with, what that means. And I'm saying we're seeing a transactional retreat from ideational leadership by the United States. And we're seeing also a phenomenon that's a backlash that's reflected in the Lowy polling of a steep decline in support for the United States and the Trump administration by a country like Australia, people from the country like Australia that you would have thought would have been bolted on supporters. But it's clearly there's the backlash I don't think that people in Washington quite appreciate yet. And of course, we're seeing this commercial diplomacy I'd never heard of commercial diplomacy. It's certainly not taught as IR theory, but it is evidently what's going on today. And we're seeing this manifest in the United States today. And arguably, it's a gamble with little precedent. And, academics, we like to have, quantitative and qualitative analysis. There's no data to base your analysis on, right? So we don't know what the consequences of this will be. It is a gamble, as I say. And I would contend we're seeing also a retreat from unipolarity and a shift towards multipolarity, and arguably what I'd describe as Yalta 2.0. I explained this when I was in Poland recently, and there was a sucking your breath because Yalta the first time meant that they got stuck behind the Iron Curtain when the deal was done. This is shocking for them. But if this is true, if we are seeing a breakup into a multipolar world, where do the lines get drawn? Is Europe part of the Russian domain? Is Asia, the rest of Asia, part of the Chinese domain? These are questions that are not settled, and it's not at all clear if that is the way but President Trump wants to go, what the implications might be. And of course, as Tom Friedman made the case, that might have worked when we were talking about the Cold War, but in the post-Cold War world, we introduced a thing called globalization, where we became interdependent. And that interdependence is actually pretty hard to unravel, but we're seeing signs of it right now, efforts to unravel the interdependence of the globalized era, the post-Cold War era, that is now well and truly over. And now, what friends and colleagues of mine have been talking about the post-American world or after America. I'm just not sure we're quite there yet. Are we catastrophizing by going there? America is not leaving the Pacific anytime soon, okay? And then there's the view of my friend and ANU colleague now at the American University in Washington, Amitav Acharya, who put in this book, The Once and Future World Order, that we actually should probably chill out and not worry about it too much, because what happened before wasn't that bad, and that perhaps we're going to return to the status quo ante. I don't know. He might be right. I hope he is. But, we can hope isn't a plan, right? It's a great thesis. I don't know how much weight to put in. I would argue, though, what we need to do is go back to first principles. And this is what I'm saying, is that the Trumpian revolution, if you like, is driving us to move away from the post-Cold War IR theory and go back to the basics. And for me, the basics starts with Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War, in which Thucydides argued that the causes of war were distilled down to three words: fear, honor, and interests. And it's a very compelling narrative that he explains in the book and that I've riffed off in my Melbourne Asian Review piece from a couple of years ago. Interestingly, of course, Graham Allison, who's hugely famous for his work on the Thucydides trap and, of course, other work as well, makes this point that he talks about a certain degree of inevitability, but he concedes that nothing is inevitable and that this is not inevitable. So it's worth reflecting on. I think also we're seeing the need to revisit this kind of the revenge of geography, if you like, with Mackinder and Spikeman's work about the heartland and the rimland coming back into vogue in a way that we had never thought was going to, when we were going through university in the last few decades, this just wasn't relevant, right? Not in the globalized world of today. And I would contend we're also needing to think more about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Certainly the people in Gaza, the people in Ukraine are thinking about this way more than they used to, right? This is about, am I going to live through the night? Do I survive the next day, right? And then, of course, in that mix, I would contend is Morgenthau. Hans Morgenthau, who wrote this wonderful story, his book, Politics Among Nations, which went out of vogue with the end of the Cold War, but I think is back in terms of relevance because of his use of the 9 elements of national power. And when we think about what can we do in this new world order, the 9 elements of power, of national power, are really worth thinking about, particularly when you think about the last 3. But what you can do on national morale, quality of government, and quality of diplomacy. These are really important points that Morgenthau thrashed out. And of course, sea power, Mahan, whoosh, back in vogue. And we're seeing this, the United States is trying to resuscitate its naval capability after seeing an incredible surge in capabilities from the Chinese PLA Navy, Coast Guard, and Maritime Militia. That's going gangbusters. My colleagues at ANU, Evelyn Goh, has written about this, the dynamics in Asia with the struggle for order, which is a compelling book. It's now 10 years old, though, and I would contend that she may well be thinking about reviewing that. I haven't discussed it with her directly, but it's a compelling narrative nonetheless, complemented by the work of my colleague Leszek Belzinski, who's just come out with this other one on the right, talking about weakening US resolve, confirming the view that China's displaced the US, right? This is the compelling dominant narrative, but he's arguing that China's facing its own challenges internally. So we can't make a straight line projection into the future from what we're seeing at the moment. But it is really interesting to look at the work of Michael Green in his book By More Than Providence, and of course Elbridge Colby, who's been in the news in the last few days. Green talks about, and this really sounds very Mackinderite, this idea of not letting any one great power dominate East Asia in a way that's inimical to America's interests. That's echoed by Colby in his book, The Strategy of Denial. And for him, it's really important to address China's growing power and ambition, arguing America can prepare and win a war, and that is key to deterrence by being ready to. So this is now the dominant kind of narratives in Washington, right? This is now the narrative that is shaping how Australia needs to engage and think and respond to the circumstances we face in 2025, right? And in that mix, Hegseth has reinforced it with his statement at the Shangri-La Dialogue, and the sense that Asia is an enduring US priority. So while we've kind of seen what's happened with Ukraine and with NATO and how Trump has dissed NATO to a certain extent, it certainly engendered a reaction, and arguably, this is one of his successes. He's got NATO to agree to 5% of GDP on defence expenditure, right? So this is taken as very much a badge of success for the Trump administration. But it also, I think we may have been drawing the wrong lesson from that, because what that was about, in my not so humble opinion, was a shift. If this multipolar world is true, it's a shift of emphasis more to our neck of the woods. In which case, if I am correct, Australia is now becoming more important to American plans than ever. That's big, folks. It's not post-America. It's right in the thick of it. Now, when we think about Australia, and I tell my American friends when I'm there, Australia tends to, because of the Mercator projection, we think it's in the corner, irrelevant, of no consequence. Of course, they're absolutely wrong. We're in the top of the game. We're the most important. And this is the point I keep making to American friends. You actually need to understand what the world looks like from down under or from up top, depending on how you look at it. And of course, Australia, we talk about rules and values and shared values. And of course, it's gone a little bit off the boil, let's face it. And most people are no longer enthused about talking about shared values because, what the transactional retreat from ideation and leadership, right? And yet we still see, if you look at that list, all the commonalities between Australia and the United States. So, it is still a very impressive list of what we have in common. And that's not to be sneezed at. So when we think about, being critical of the United States, we need to not completely throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I would argue that there's a five-fingered approach, if you like, to understanding some key elements to the Australia-US relationship. One is the US alliance. Two is the bilateral free trade agreement, which is, getting buffeted at the moment. Three is the trilateral AUKUS. Four is the quadrilateral, the Quad. And five is the Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangement. So there's five: alliance, free trade, trilateral AUKUS, quadrilateral Quad, and the Five Eyes. These are elements of the relationship that you can't just dismiss with an After America one-liner, right? It's not that simple, right? Of course, I write a bit about that in Revealing Secrets, a gratuitous plug for one of my books. So the mouse is just locked again. There we go. Okay. And of course, we know about the historic relationship, goes a long way back. The former ambassador Joe Hockey talked about 100 years of mateship, and because we've got lampooned to a certain extent because it's much more complicated. That there's shared interests and overlapping interests that's driven the relationship more than values, arguably, I would contend. But it's certainly been a big factor. And of course, when we think about when we last faced an existential crisis, where did we really face the crunch? It was in the Pacific, and it was particularly, I would contend, Guadalcanal. Now, in Australia, we tend to think Kokoda because of us fighting with MacArthur in his part of the patch, because he and Nimitz hated each other's guts, understandable on one level, but they didn't operate closely together. Guadalcanal, though, was the main emphasis by the Japanese, right? And now, I don't know if you noticed, but Guadalcanal is Solomon Islands. Have you noticed what's been happening in Solomon Islands lately? Right. So in the meantime, now this Lowy Power Index I find quite a compelling illustration. I've added France and Canada to it because I think that's really important. They're important Pacific powers as well. But when you look at, and I say to my American friends, you've got to look beyond just looking straight west to China. The world is more than just China, 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 right? Of course, and when you look at the world from down under, you're seeing a much more diffuse picture. You're seeing Southeast Asia, you're seeing the Pacific, you're seeing these other countries that have agency. You know, Morgenthau was right. They have a lot of agency. And this is something that I think for Australian policymakers, we need to be mindful of. And my sense is that is the case. Policymakers here appreciate the agency that these countries have. And we're seeing the expansion of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And of course, interestingly enough, the last meeting, Brazil and China and Russia don't turn up. Putin and Xi aren't there. So what does it say about the BRICS? I think we can probably chill. Amitav Acharya is probably right on that one. But I do think we are seeing a manifestation of what I'm calling unrestricted competition. And this is, I think, what's driving the Hegseth kind of view of response in the United States. It's riffing off this book by two Chinese colonels in the late 1990s called Unrestricted Warfare, right? Now, we got fixed up. We didn't buy it, right? Because we've got a binary in English of peace and war. We never found that compelling. But if you take out the word warfare and put in the word competition, click, 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 click. All of a sudden, all of those things become much more compelling, right? They're all kind of happening, right? They've been happening for years, right? And when we think about competition, and I make this point to my American colleagues, competition is multifaceted, right? It involves collaboration, competition, cooperation. It's actually compromise, sometimes confrontation and contestation, and hopefully the avoidance of violence, conflict. But it's a mixture of all of those things. This is not an on-off, yes, no, peace, war. This is a complicated scenario, right, where we have to be really adept to handle the complexity and the nuance, which Albo's trying to handle right now in his visit to Beijing. And of course, along the way, we've seen a transformation, Chinese manufacturing way outstripping America's. And we're seeing in the last 25 years, China's, since accession to the World Trade Organization, a transformation of the space. China's rise, and we had this bit of a debate on LinkedIn about this, whether China can be compared to the British Empire. There are clear limitations to the parallels. But if you think about in 25 years, they've gone in the picture on the right there from being dominant trading partners of a handful of countries to being dominant trading partners globally, right? It is extraordinary. In 25 years, they did effectively what the Brits took 250 years to do, right? They had the Industrial Revolution, they needed raw materials, they then needed markets, they then needed security for the raw materials and markets, they then needed governance for the security for the raw materials and markets. It happened incrementally over 250 years. This has happened in 25. Now, it's not the British Empire, it's not the same, but there are parallels. And it's happened in 1/10 of the time. And this is, I think, spooking the Americans. It's definitely spooking the Americans, and it is driving this Hegsethian-like perspective on the scale of the challenge, right? Which is what is affecting their pressure on us in Australia, right? That's, I think, the important point. Now, when we think about the Pacific, most Americans don't realise how extensive America's real estate holdings in the Pacific are. And I would contend those who say that the post-American world has arrived also overlook the geography. America's presence in the Pacific, and this map gives you the sense of it, is extraordinary, right? It is not fleeting. It is not a fraction. It's a major component of the Pacific equation, right? So, and the red goose eggs are where China's been signing security pacts recently. Guadalcanal, Oh, Solomon Islands, that's right. Fancy that. So my point is that China has a right to engage in this space, but we need to be mindful that the United States is not going away, that Australia has a stake in this space, and this is where enormous fisheries resources are involved, enormous political influence, and of course, there's 30 plus votes in the UN General Assembly that most American policymakers don't realise, most Australian policymakers don't realise. 11 in, if you include East Timor, in ASEAN, and then another, close to 20 across the Pacific, all with UN General Assembly votes. Why would that be of any consequence, right? Of course, we know the answer. And of course, in the meantime, we've got what my colleague Brendan Taylor talks about, the 4 flashpoints, the prospects of war from the Korean Peninsula across the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and of course, Taiwan. And there's more, of course. There's many permutations and potential combinations of all of these that could manifest themselves at short notice. But I think it's worth dwelling a little bit on the Korean War or the Taiwan, because this is one we've been pressured on just in the last few days about Taiwan, right? You think about the Korean War, and in January 1950, Dean Acheson goes to the National Press Club in Washington, and he says to the folk there that America's interests extend to the border of Japan, and by implication, not Taiwan and not Korea. And Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-un's grandpa, says, beauty, job's on, right? So they invade, not realizing that the incredibly strong global reaction to that egregious act of violence, right? That he thought he'd get away with it. Geez, why not, of course, then Australia contributes to the UN command, but 1 million Chinese die and the son of Mao Zedong dies in that fight. And what? The border's basically where it was in 1950. Why would you do that? You don't want that, right? I would contend this piece in the Foreign Affairs a little while ago about them squeezing, not seizing, is a far more compelling explanation. And Kevin Rudd, now the ambassador in Washington, in his book, The Avoidable War, talks about managed strategic competition. And I think that is viable. We just have to be very deft with our diplomacy as we try and do that. And I think our Prime Minister, Albo, is trying to do that. That's my reading of it. Along the way, and this is, being in Washington and in not too far away from where the ambassador works, I have had the privilege of reading his book, his PhD thesis turned into a book on Xi Jinping, and it's pretty compelling, a pretty rigorous consideration. And he is now really widely regarded in Washington for his views on this, consulted very broadly, okay? He is the go-to guy on China in Washington right now. And he makes the point that Xi is, from his speeches and his writings, which he's studied in detail, he's a Marxist-Leninist nationalist. What the hell is that? Well, he believes in communism. He believes in party control of the state with him in charge of the party. And he believes in revenge for the century of humiliation. Right? Because we were there in Beijing in 1900. Right? So, China says it's ready for war with America, and it circumnavigates Australia. Naval gunfire exercise halfway between Auckland and Sydney in the flight path. Nothing to see here, folks. Move along. Surely. Right? In the meantime, I would argue that the reverse opium war is going on in our space. And I would contend, and this is up for debate, but I would contend that this is a manifestation of that revenge. And then we've got a clear nervousness about the jugular vein of the Indo-Pacific, the Malacca dilemma, the Malacca Strait, right? The efforts to cut a path through the Kra Isthmus, get a Kra Canal going, the Chalkpu pipeline, the Yunnan Chalkpu pipeline that China defends, places a lot of emphasis on protecting so they can have oil and gas piping up through from the Bay of Bengal, circumventing the requirement for passage through the Malacca Strait, and of course the spike in debt that people have decried as being not a trap, but geez, it darn well looks like one when you look at that graph in the top right-hand corner, right? So this is the world we live in, and of course ASEAN is a focus for Australia. And it's not so much a focus for the United States, and it's something I've been stressing when I engage with people in Washington. You got to think about ASEAN. It really matters. I know you might think it's a broken reed. That's the Peter Varghese interpretation, which I think is misplaced. Yes, it lacks coherence. Yes, it lacks resolve. But unity in diversity, it's an aspirational statement, not a statement of fact. Right? This is a grouping of countries that is particularly diverse. And a recent PhD grad, Hunter Marston, wrote about ASEAN hedging. It's a cracker of a piece with East Asia Forum on blunting, broadening, boosting, and binding. It's a really interesting piece. And so what it's saying for American policymakers and for Australian ones is they feel they have agency and they are open to negotiations, right? They are not a closed book, right? This is a space where Australia has influence. The world is looking on. And of course, in the meantime, there's a massive civil war going on in Myanmar, and everybody's looking askance, right? Including the Prime Minister of Malaysia, who's happy to cast aspersions about Israel's actions against Gaza without doing much at all about the problem in his own neighbourhood, right? Which is a bit, as I say, everyone loves a good set of double standards. So it's understandable, it's pretty much the norm in international relations. But it's not just about China. This is a space where the neighbours in Southeast Asia have their own squabbles, right? Between Malaysia and its neighbours, between Thailand and Cambodia and Vietnam. And a lot of it, people think it's about borders. It's also about culture, and it's all about economics because of if you think about particularly the one in the top bottom right-hand corner, the Gulf of Thailand, the resources there, and American companies are involved in this space and others as well. So this is an important space for contestation. Now, I would say for us, as we reflect on what's happening, it's worth reflecting on the 10 points of tension, or the dialectics, I like to describe them as, that I wrote about a little while ago. And I'll just quickly race through them, where trying to reconcile our history and geography. We are essentially Anglo-European transplants sitting on the edge of Asia, with few of us knowing regional languages. We're all, as I said, we're barely monolingual. Very few of us speak more than one language. This audience is a rare exception, of course. And we're a middle power with small power pretensions. We don't have the stories of great explorers finding lakes and rivers and verdant valleys as they travel, like Lewis and Clark across the Pacific, across the continent. We've got Burke and Wills and Leichhardt, right? It's not a happy story, right? It's one of us having to measure our pretensions, right? We have got a fear of abandonment and a fear of entrapment, and this is captured in a number of works, some of which are out on the bookshelves out there. Alan Gingell, the former president here, wrote about this, of course. But this is, and I'm saying we like to have the Goldilocks solution. We want America to stay, but we don't want to be sucked into a war in Asia, right? So we'll have our cake and eat it. And we've got this issue about being a dependent ally, which Coral Bell wrote about. And of course, we're also this sense of being an independent ally, which Shannon Tao wrote about. And they're both right? They're both telling the truth to a certain extent. But this is the dilemma as we think about how we respond to the pressures from the United States, from the Trump administration, from this transactional retreat from ideational leadership. We need to be weighing up the circumstances and how we respond and the way in which we do so, right? Of course, the defence of Australia and forward defence, this has been an ongoing debate for half a century. My colleagues at ANU, Paul Tibb and others, and particularly here with Kim Beazley, we've had this sense of we fought forward in the two world wars, Korea, Vietnam, elsewhere, and then in between we hide behind the moat. But what we're realising today is that we actually need to engage with our neighbourhood more than ever, particularly Indonesia. And of course, Beck Stratting and Joanne Wallace have talked about this in their book, Girt by Sea, Australia's Security. And I think they were Beck was here, or Joanne was here a little while ago. Beck was, yeah. Beck. That's right. Anyway, it's a great book about reimagining the significance of the seas and the investments we have in that space, and that we need to be much more respectful and appreciative of. Another dialectic, we lead and we follow. So we lead like we did in East Timor, and I was just there last week with a couple of colleagues when I was involved in the Interfet intervention in '99. And we follow like we did in Korea and in Iraq and Afghanistan. But this regional engagement space, this is a space where I'm trying to explain to Americans, this is where it really matters to Australia. You think about Taiwan, scenarios up there. Actually, we're more concerned about Southeast Asia, right? This is a space where when we faced an existential crisis, it happened here between Singapore and Guadalcanal, right? And everything in between. There are more Commonwealth war graves in that space than just about anywhere else with Australians, okay? So what? Well, the prospect of Australia's defence being dependent on the whim of Donald Trump means I would contend, as I have for a while now, that we need to muscle up on our own, right? What does that look like? Well, ironically, it means getting more American kit, amongst other things, right? Ironically. And we also need to try and reconcile our economic and national security. And I think Albo's trying to do that right now, because we are not the United States. We're not selling NVIDIA chips to China, right? We sell iron ore, coal, gas, and pretty simple basic stuff. And that's actually, so we need to, and I know that they're having this debate about how much we push back on US pressure over what we do to try and comply with American directives. AUKUS, I'm happy to deal with that in the Q&A. I won't dwell on it, but I think there is an explanation there. And my response to the Colby review is this: Australia's right to refuse committing to a Taiwan war hypothetical. It's not in the ANZUS Treaty. It's not in the AUKUS agreement. Americans haven't committed to it either. It's not appropriate that we make a commitment to a hypothetical, an open-ended hypothetical, way beyond the scope of anything we've technically agreed to so far. And I won't dwell on that. But in the meantime, we've got looming environmental catastrophe, the Anthropocene, if you like, are all coming down. And of course, there's enormous denial of that in the United States, which is generating huge challenges for us in Australia. How do we manage this? How do we deal with the COP, which one's the next COP? 21? 31. How do we do this without completely, getting up the noses of the US administration? And then there's Antarctica. What happens if that place melts, folks? And we're facing enormous competition there. The United States has bases there. Russia has bases there. China has bases. We have claimed 40% of it, by the way. We have a land border with Norway, France, New Zealand, Chile, Argentina, and Britain. Who would have thunk? All right? Who would have thunk? If that place melts, what are we going to do? Well, I'm telling you now, we need to think. And we need to engage with our American counterparts to think more about this too. In the meantime, there's a scope of global catastrophic risks that most people seem to be blithely unaware of that we potentially face. And of course, for Australia, we've done almost all of these things at least once or twice before. But if they start happening concurrently, then OMG, somebody help us. And big fix, Albert Palazzo's talked about playing down the Navy and AUKUS, talks up missile and air and ground and based missile defence. On one level it's compelling, on another I would contend it's a flawed argument. I don't like the idea of situating the appreciation. I think we need to have a much more balanced option. And Sam Roggevin, he's talked about us being able to basically not being so offensive, basically being like an echidna with short spikes, so that nobody gets offensive. But my problem is that I don't think short spikes are going to cut it for much longer. Right? I mean, you can read it for yourself and make your own judgment. I'm actually thinking what we need is actually a menagerie, not just an echidna. That's my proposal. It's a work in progress, but I'm saying we need a menagerie approach, right? The United States is in the mix, but our partnership with Southeast Asia and the Pacific is fundamental to that. And I proposed at OSIS, the Oceanic Conference on International Studies, just last week, that we should propose a Pacific Islands Federation. I'm happy to entertain that in Q&A as well. Now, one of the things I'm doing in the US is doing research. I was tasked to kind of foster research collaboration. That's been very, very difficult with all the cutbacks. The project I won a grant from, Minerva, has been cancelled. Others have gone by the wayside as well. National Institute of Health, etc., National Science Foundation, drastic cuts, right? I think we need to be thinking about, though, despite the flaws of their model, The UARC, the University Administered Research Affiliated Research Centres, and federally funded research and development centres are they're incredible, right? We have nothing like that in Australia. We have DSTG, the Defence Science Technology Group, we have CSIRO, and we have the university sector, and never the twain shall meet. Just about, right? It's very dysfunctional in Australia. We need to lift our game. This is one of the things I've come back to try and tell people here in Australia. We need to lift our research game. If we're going to play in this much more competitive, challenging global environment, we need to lift our game in collaboration between the universities and the research that the government provides. So there we have it, the bluff, great power competition, looming environmental catastrophe, spectrum of governance challenges, accelerated by the fourth industrial revolution. And that's why I'm telling Americans they should come and study in Australia, right? Because you really want to come, it's cheap as chips, 64 cents to the dollar, world-class education. Of course, there's lots of other compelling reasons. But essentially, we've got lots of good options at ANU. And I'm selling ANU, I'm selling Team Australia. And that's what I'm doing when I go back to the swamp. Thank you very much.
Okay, that was a very mercenary end to your talk, John. So I think I'll take the opportunity to remind you all that the AIIA is a member organisation, and if you're not a member yet, please do sign up. You heard me mention Joanne Wallace when John was talking about the book with her and Beck. We've just revamped our website, and now our flagship journal that Joanne edits, the Australian Journal of International Affairs, is available all the way back to 1947 for members. So you can get online and download that. Now, we have got Q&A open online. So those of you who are online, please do feel free to type into the box. We'll come to the rest of you soon, but I'm going to steal the first question, maybe even questions. So I spent June sort of kicking around Europe, going to various conferences and talking with various officials. And there was quite a sort of assumption in Europe that we were facing similar challenges here in the Indo-Pacific, and what we needed, according to some, was some kind of arrangement like NATO. And you heard that reiterated in Foreign Affairs. Eli Ratner wrote a similar kind of article that we need some kind of NATO-type structure in the Indo-Pacific. I'm fairly skeptical about that, just because the Indo-Pacific is so vast. There's different sub-regions, if you like. But what seems to be happening is the United States is taking NATO's declaration that it will reach a 5% of GDP spending, or 3.5% on defense and 1.5% on defense-related issues, as some sort of standard that Australia should adhere to. You've already said that that Australia shouldn't really play hypotheticals with Taiwan. Should it be responding to the request by Colby and others or Hegseth rather, and others, that we raise our defence spending to 3.5% of GDP? Or because, as you said, we are now sort of the more important region, does that, if not, does that give Australia a certain amount of leverage with which it can negotiate against these Trumpian demands? That's my first question. So, my second question, very briefly, is I was interested in your comments on a Pacific Federation. I'd like you to flesh that out a bit more. Being of the Pacific myself, as you know, when you say words like federation, that seems to imply one nation state. I can't see a lot of Pacific Islands going for that, as well as partners like New Zealand going for that. Could you flesh that out a bit more and tell us what you mean?
I'll start with the second one first. So what I have in mind is an EU-like construct, where actually there's a supranational body that sits over the states of the Pacific Islands Forum, and that the states then have representation at a elected body, a bit like the EU Parliament, that is so it would probably need to be bicameral. So you have a body where everybody has a say, like we have with our Senates, Senate representation, but another body that is that has a more proportionally allocated representation to manage the kinds of things that the EU does for Europe. That's where I'm going with it. Riffing off a little bit, the Australian Federation itself, which has 3 tiers of government, local, state and federal, and each with different defined responsibilities. I think there's a way where we could actually use the EU model and think about how we bring in New Zealand, Australia, Papua New Guinea, and then the smaller states of the Pacific, and including a mechanism for the French territories to have an association and a working mechanism whereby we actually collaborate together. And much like with the EU, you have your own nationality, you have your own citizenship, but you have a shared citizenship as well. And I think that's the model for the future. The model we have at the moment is broken. We're not doing enough for the Pacific. We're not doing enough to face that spectrum of challenges I addressed. Great power competition, environmental catastrophe, governance challenges, and there's enormous governance challenges in the Pacific, and I touched on it briefly. And then there's also, we forget about the vulnerability from cables. We have enormous vulnerabilities in the Pacific that are important for Australia to have a more prominent role in providing governance for. So that's where I'm going with that. And now it's not, it's about respect, mutual respect, collegial, constructive, engaging, incrementally, if you like, but with that model of the EU. And people like to decry the EU for its problems, but the world, it's a bit like correlation isn't causation. But before the European Economic Community, which became the EU, Europe was a pretty ugly place, right? And it's become incredibly attractive. It's brought, people are dying to get there from around the world. Even Australians trying to get dual passports and dual citizenship so they can spend their winter Canberra months in fairer places. The point is, though, that there are aspects of that model which I think could be made to work for us in our context. It's a big call, I know, but somebody's got to come up with big calls if we're going to move from where we are. The first one again, leverage. So I think we have limited leverage. I think it's a real pity that Hegseth said what he said. The Australian government, I think, was coming around to the sense that we needed to do more. There was a growing consensus that what we're doing on defence in particular, but on national security writ large, is not enough. And there's even the government's rhetoric has been that that's the case, but we're getting there slowly. My sense is that the remarks from the US Secretary of Defence has actually pushed the debate back, made it much more about us making our own calls, that dependent versus independent argument, I talked about before. So I think it was counterproductive for him to say that. But I do think that we need to find a way. And part of the problem for us is we're quite wasteful in our defence. And there's clearly, the way we do shipbuilding, the way we just waste so much money in the defence space. We should be doing it much more efficiently and effectively, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't do more. So, yeah, half-baked answer there. Thanks.
Okay, fantastic. Now, if you've got a question in the room, put up your hand. Before we go, when we get to you, can you please stand up and tell us who you are and give us your question. And if you're online, I haven't seen any online questions yet, but if you're online, please do type in the Q&A. Rosemary. Oh, sorry.
Rosemary Ganley, and I'm a member of USI as well, so joint membership. I was fascinated all the way through your talk. You kept saying, and this is what I'm talking to Americans about.
Mm-hmm.
What I really want to know is, are they hearing you? Is it making any difference? Are anybody out there in America actually got a brain?
So The United States has got many very very bright people. Right? It is a land of extremes, I would contend. It's got probably more really accomplished people than the whole population of Australia, but that's still only a fraction of the country, right? So, and unlike Australia, they don't have compulsory voting, and I think that they would benefit from having compulsory voting. You would then get more of the mainstream buy-in. Another point I'd note about the United States, it's certainly in my travels, the United States is such an amazing country. It's very attractive to visit, in part because it's so interesting. It's got 50 states. It's as diverse as Europe, if not more. You don't get the same linguistic diversity necessarily, but you get incredible diversity culturally and in terms of the geography and there's so many aspects of the United States that are fascinating. People love to go and explore the Southwest, the Northwest, the Northeast, the Southeast, the Centre. There's so many interesting things to explore. So Americans are understandably focused on their own world. There's so much news that's generated by the United States. It's hard for other countries' news to hit the headlines, right? Whereas this is the case in Australia. We get a lot of American news because they produce so much, and it's very easy for our networks to just download it and use it. We don't get so much out of China, out of Russia, out of Africa. We don't have that kind of network of readily accessible English language, digestible news grabs that you get from the United States. So this drives, in my view, an introspection in the United States that feeds, particularly in light of the 25 years of catastrophe in the Middle East, I would contend, a desire to back off from the world and just focus on our wonderful part of the world, where you can go across, you can hire an SUV or a van and traverse the country and live large. Visit Lewis and Clark. Good luck to you. But this is, I think, some of the factors that work in the United States that makes it hard for us to understand if you're not actually putting yourself in their shoes. Thanks.
Okay, great. Sorry, folks online. There are actually quite a lot of questions. So we'll take two from online. We'll take three people, but there are two similar questions. There's one from Lakmile Singhi and Michael Cook, who used to be the president of our Adelaide, or rather South Australia branch, and they're both asking about AUKUS. Michael asks, in particular, what are your views on the AUKUS review, including its possible recommendations, and how can the government prepare itself for the implications on the broader relationship? That's one, and I'll go to Christopher Skinner, who's a member in New South Wales, asking how is BRICS relevant for the Indo-Pacific? So AUKUS and BRICS.
So, okay, I'll deal with BRICS first. BRICS is really interesting because Indonesia's joined. That makes it extremely interesting for us, right? If they're interested, we should be interested. We should be very interested. Indonesia is so important to us, and yet we don't seem to appreciate how it is. So we've been playing a game of snakes and ladders in our relationship with Indonesia. We go up the ladder incrementally and then we make improvements, and then we trip down the snake over beef, over boats, over spies, over clemency, over Timor, over Papua, Jerusalem, you name it. We've done a lot of things that really get up the nose of the Indonesians, right? So we haven't been very good at understanding their worldview. So BRICS is part of it because they have this thing called Bebas dan Aktif, which is this free and active foreign policy. It goes back to the kind of reaction to the Dutch colonial era and the sense of, well, we're going to do it our way, right? And this is how, it goes back to Sukarno and the idea of Indonesia being a country that's independent and proud of its own heritage, its own identity, and not needing to be told by any great power what to do. This is the context in which BRICS features for them because it's an alternative, right? It's a mechanism that gives them a platform to engage other than ASEAN, other than ones that are seen to be pro-American, where they can manifest this Bebas dan Aktif appearance, right? I don't think it matters all that much personally. But we'll see how that unfolds, particularly given the limited efficacy of BRICS with Putin and Xi not turning up to the last one in Brazil. Now on AUKUS, I gave a talk on AUKUS here before, and in the nutshell, the point I make is that diesel electrics don't work it for Australia anymore. Right? We're a maritime nation, and we have for a century or more considered submarines critical to defence. The problem with diesels is that if you come up to snort to recharge batteries, the wake of that snorkel moving through the water is detectable from space. And now we have almost saturation low Earth orbit satellites, 30 plus years of China pattern analysis of where we go and when we surface, coupled with artificial intelligence and armed drones. You're cooked. You're cooked. Don't do it, right? Go home. The only way to avoid that is to stay underwater, right? And the only way to do that, to transit, and not to get to the South China Sea, just to get to Darwin, right? Just to circumnavigate Australia, you have to do it with nuclear propulsion. There's no other way. You can't do it safely, right? So yes, it's problematic, and yes, the way ScoMo did the deal is it's untidy, right? But technologically, we don't have a fallback. And now we're 3 or 4 years into a deal with the United States. And I had somebody ask me earlier today, well, should we go back to the French? Hello? How's that going to help us? Set us back another 4 or 5 years and lose trust and credibility even more. I just think we're stuck where we are. We have to make a compelling case to Hegseth and to Trump that this is in America's interests. And here I would argue, going back to, I think I had the picture up briefly before. Maybe I'll come back to it. This, I think, is a really important point about. Let's see if not letting me do it. That's okay. Perth was the biggest submarine base in the Indian Ocean in the Pacific War. Right. 170 plus Allied submarines based out of there. The reason why the Thai-Burma Railway had to be built, because Japan couldn't get its ships up the Malacca Strait, because they all got sunk by submarines from Perth, right? That is an incredibly consequential submarine base, right? And I don't think Elbridge Colby quite understands the significance of that piece of real estate, but it's akin, in my view, to the significance of what Des Bald called the suitable piece of real estate, Pine Gap. It's up there, okay? It's incredibly consequential in terms of the deterrent effect. When I talk about the Malacca dilemma before, the complicating factor on Chinese planning, should they want to force the issue over Taiwan, should they want to do that, the Malacca dilemma is deeply problematic. And submarines operating out of Perth makes it even more problematic, which is a huge, in my view, huge deterrent. And I think that makes it pretty darn compelling. So should they say, we're not producing enough fast enough? That's not ideal. Like, we've been paying money for them to hurry up. And we've also got industry in Australia that can actually help unblock the stovepipes, all right? Because we've got small to medium enterprises qualified. We've got legislation changed in the US, bicameral, bipartisan support. Senate, House, they love us, right? They want this to work. Now, Colby's, equivocal, but the US Congress is really behind us on this. They want it to happen. So what can we do? Well, we can try and help speed up the process, get rid of some of the bottlenecks. And this is where, as I say, legislation's been changed, ITAR regulations, all sorts of American regulations have been shifted to allow Australia to contribute. It's starting to happen. Slowly, admittedly, we need to do more, but I think it can happen it can accelerate. Even with that, though, American industry seemed to be pretty slow at picking up the pace, right? So ultimately, they may well decide, well, we can give it to you, but we're going to give it to you late, right? We're going to have to cop what we get dealt with. We don't hold all the cards, as a president once said. And in this case, we don't. We hold some of them, but not all of them. But I think the point is that we will get, and we're already starting to see American submarines rotating through there. We're building up the capability to maintain submarines, nuclear propulsion submarines out of Perth. We're building up the capability in the Royal Australian Navy to have crews can operate these that will eventually, hopefully, operate Australian ships. I suspect for a while, though, because we've taken so long to make a decision on submarines, we're going to have to live the consequence of our own actions, which is that we're going to have to continue to help crew American boats for quite some time. So this is a problem because it's politically damaging. It's politically not very acceptable. It's not, the great self-reliant Australia. But, who do you blame? Well, you can blame a succession of governments, right, that have varicated over what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. And we are, but, much like in Alice in Wonderland, I wouldn't, if that's where you wanted to go, I wouldn't have started from here, right? But this is where we are. We're in 2025. We've committed to this AUKUS deal, and it's probably got, some knobs on it, but it is what we've got. It's the only deal we've got. And so in my view, it's like, well, the idea of sinking the sub deal, pardon the pun. So what are you going to do instead? What is a maritime trading nation? A nation that lives on their rim, girt by beaches, some people say. We live on our beaches. We live on the coast. We're extremely exposed and vulnerable, as the circumnavigation by the Chinese flotilla demonstrated. Are we just going to walk away and not have subs? I think that's a bad idea.
Thanks very much. Moving from AUKUS to JAUKUS, the concept that Japan might get involved in this currently tripartite arrangement. We're currently taking an inordinate amount of time to decide between a MECO and a Megami surface combatant. It seems to me that, quite aside from the technical reasons for choosing a Japanese replacement for our ANZUS class, there's a hell of a lot to be said for tying the Japanese into our part of the world and getting them heavily involved in our operational capabilities. And Japan has also got the capability to do AUKUS 2 missile technology and a lot of other things, and they do them on time and they do them swiftly. Now, they haven't been a great exporter in the past, but that's for constitutional reasons, not because they're not capable at producing equipment that we could use. I would have thought that visionary procurement, which we don't seem to have much of, would be looking towards that northern ally in the Pacific.
So it's interesting you say that, because we're closer to Japan now than we've ever been. Even when we had the Anglo-Japanese alliance, Australia wasn't thrilled, right? We're now right in. We're both feet, both hands. We're right in with the Japanese. So I don't know that AUKUS or JAUKUS is all that consequential, because we're already doing quite a lot bilaterally and trilaterally, and even, with the Brits, if you want to include them in that, because the Brits and Japan are working more closely than ever, actually, at least for 100 years. So I think what's already happening is pretty good. And I don't think we need to overly worry about concocting a structure to make what's already happening that much more effective. I think it's pretty good already, and the trajectory is for it to do more. So I'm reasonably sanguine about that. And going back to Bryce's point about NATO and a European or an Asian NATO, we're already doing a lot of stuff with the Philippines, with Japan, with Korea, with the United States, with New Zealand. Look what's happening at Talisman Sabre. We've got 19 countries, 35,000 forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, Space, and Cyber collaborating. This is pretty darned impressive, right? And it's done without NATO. These are countries that want to work with us. So I don't think we're ever going to have an Article 5 type agreement where, if Japan is attacked, Australia is guaranteed to protect it. No. Much like I don't think we should promise the United States over Taiwan. But look at our track record. Look what Australia does. Look what Australia's done for the last 120 freaking years, right? We're a pretty good partner. And I think the countries around us recognise that. Thanks.
Okay, fantastic. We've actually gone over time, but I'm going to allow one more because I think, John likes to talk. So,
Shocked to hear, sir.
More questions, but I'm sorry. We'll just go to this gentleman.
Thank you. Gareth Knappman, ANU. Okay, John, I'd like you to just talk about that slide you had up, and you had to go through it really quick about the environmental strategic issues.
Yes.
And under the previous regime in the United States, they were sort of much more aware of it.
Correct.
Now the current one appears to be in total denial.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on this topic from how they're going to respond in the future?
Yes, it's a really challenging one for the government to grapple with right now, because we see it as important. The Pacific sees it important, and it's a felt need in the Pacific. And for us, that should matter enormously. And as I say, this idea of a Pacific Islands Federation is predicated on us being sympathetic, understanding, and helpful to the Pacific and their challenges, right? We have to do more. And this is, I think, an argument that can be made. You know, my point back, if you are a climate change denier, okay, you do you, right? The point is, though, that Pacific Island countries require electricity. Their societies have grown to such an extent that they're actually not viable without electricity and without the internet, right? So guess what? Salt water and electricity, a bad combination, right? So you get sea level surge, and we've seen this already in some remote places. It's catastrophic. It's catastrophic, right? This is not like 100 or 200 years ago where, you know, we didn't care or we didn't notice if people died and drowned. Now it's in your face and it's existential. So there is, in my view, a compelling national interest and alliance interest rationale to say, back at you, you're wrong on this, because we need to support the Pacific, because we need them. Even if it's just, if you're only satisfied for that in geopolitical terms, then bully for you. We see the environmental challenges. We see that as critical, and as part of that Venn diagram, it's not to be dismissed. Thanks for the great question.
All right, thanks, John. That was a masterful display of your breadth of knowledge and your depth as well. And thank you all for coming. As I said, remember, the AIIA is a membership organisation. If you're not a member already, make sure you become one. Check out our new website at internationalaffairs.org.au. In the meantime, I would not only like to thank John for this presentation, I want to officially welcome to the club of AIIA Fellows with this statuette. It's the last in our old series of statuettes, and I'm afraid to take it out of the box because it might break apart. But here it is, John. Welcome, and thanks for all you've done to contribute to foreign policy in Australia. I'll get a photo later. Thanks, Ralph. And I think there might be some more sandwiches. There's certainly more wine, so please indulge. You can network for the next little while. You guys at home have to provide your own wine.